The roar of the pumper truck, the crackle of the radio, then nothing. Only the agonizing silence. Chris Vance, firefighter, had lost his world of sound saving a child. 17 months and 4 days later, he found himself among the unheard mews of shelter cats, seeking a different kind of rescue. The world had gone silent for Chris Vance 17 months and 4 days ago. It wasn't a gradual fading but a sudden, violent severance, a brutal slamming of a door. The memory of sound was a phantom limb, an itch he could never scratch. He remembered the roar of the pumper truck, the crackle of the radio, the shouts of his brothers in arms, a symphony of controlled chaos he had conducted with instinct and courage. His life had been defined by noise. Now, its absence defined him. The wail of the final siren as he was loaded into an ambulance, a child's life saved and his own irrevocably altered, was the last sound he ever heard. His new world was the Oak Creek Community Cat Shelter. Here, the noise was constant but unheard. The frantic mews of hungry kittens, the low growls of territorial toms, the cheerful, soundless chatter of the other volunteers. For Chris, it was a silent ballet. He moved with a quiet purpose that bordered on invisibility. A large man built of firefighter's muscle who had learned to make himself small, to fold his strength into gentleness. His hands, scarred from a life of grappling with ladders and axes, were now masters of the most delicate tasks, coaxing a terrified stray from the back of a cage, cleaning matted fur with a soft cloth, offering a steady, warm palm to the nervous and the forsaken. The other volunteers were kind, but their kindness was a constant reminder of the chasm between their world and his. They would smile brightly, nod, or write brief, functional notes on the communal whiteboard. "Need more litter," one might read. He would nod back, the gesture feeling hollow, a pantomime of the easy camaraderie he once knew. He remained a ghost in their periphery, a man defined by what he lacked. He didn't mind, not really. It was better than the pity in people's eyes, better than the strained conversations where they shouted, as if sheer volume could breach the fortress of silence that encased him. Here, among the cats, there was no need for that. They judged him not by his broken ears, but by the stillness of his presence and the warmth of his hands. In their company, the silence wasn't an emptiness. It was a language he was finally beginning to understand. Then came Soot. He was a creature forged from fire and fear, a feral tomcat pulled from the wreckage of an apartment blaze. His fur, once likely a sleek black, was matted with ash and grime, giving him the ghostly, gray appearance that earned him his name. He was a tightly coiled spring of fury, occupying the largest, most reinforced cage in the isolation ward. Any approach was met with a guttural hiss that vibrated the very air, followed by a lightning-fast swipe of claws that left deep gouges in leather gloves. The shelter's most experienced handlers, a pair of retired veterinary techs, tried everything: calming pheromone diffusers, tempting morsels of tuna, the slow blink method. All failed. Soot remained a ball of untamable rage, a living echo of the trauma that had created him. After a week, a sense of weary resignation settled over the shelter. Discussions turned grim, the word unadoptable hanging in the air like a death sentence. The volunteers began to walk a wider path around his cage, their sympathy curdling into fear. But where they saw a lost cause, Chris saw a reflection. He saw the same fire, the same terror, the same trapped-in-a-collapsing world feeling that lived in the quiet recesses of his own mind. He began a silent vigil. Every day, for an hour, he would pull a plastic stool to a spot just outside the zone of Soot's explosive reactions. He didn't try to speak, to soothe, to touch. He just sat. He didn't look directly at the cat, but kept him in his peripheral vision, a technique he'd learned in the fire service to stay aware of his surroundings without signaling a threat. He focused on his own breathing, making it slow, deep, and rhythmic, a silent metronome of calm. He would mimic the cat's subtle movements. If Soot shifted his weight to his back paws, Chris would lean back slightly in his chair. It was a conversation without sound, a dialogue of posture and presence. For days, nothing changed. The hissing continued. The frantic pacing in the cage went on, but Chris was patient. He had nothing but time. Then, one afternoon, the first glimmer of a breakthrough appeared. In the middle of his silent watch, Chris noticed the hissing had stopped. He slowly turned his head. Soot was no longer pacing. He was sitting, still as a statue, his yellow eyes fixed on the quiet man. The fear was still there, a palpable force field around him, but for the first time it was laced with a thread of pure, unadulterated curiosity. Jess Albright first noticed Chris as an anomaly. A linguistics major writing her senior thesis on non-verbal communication. She was spending her summer break at the shelter, not just out of a love for cats, but for the raw, unfiltered honesty of their language. In her academic world, words were often used to conceal as much as they revealed. Here, a flattened ear or a flick of a tail was pure, unadulterated truth. She observed how the other volunteers interacted with Chris, with a kind of gentle, almost apologetic distance. They communicated in necessities, not nuances, but Jess saw more. She saw how the most traumatized cats, the ones who cowered from every other human, would sometimes settle in a quiet corner near him, as if his silence created a sanctuary. Her curiosity about him sharpened into focused study the day she learned about Soot. She'd heard the whispers about the demon cat in isolation, had seen the deep, angry scratches on a handler's forearm. While others saw a problem to be managed, Jess saw a case study in extreme communication breakdown. From a discreet distance, hidden partly by a stack of donated blankets, she finally witnessed Chris's ritual. She watched him pull up the plastic stool, settle into his deliberate calm, and begin his silent conversation. At first, it looked like he was doing nothing at all, but Jess, trained to deconstruct the grammar of silence, saw a masterclass unfolding. She saw the masterful de-escalation in his averted gaze, a signal that transcended species to say, "I am not a predator." She recognized the mirroring of Soot's posture as a classic technique for building rapport, a physical whisper of "I am like you, I am no threat." She watched, mesmerized, as Chris seemed to sense the cat's agitation not through sound, but through the faint tremor of the concrete floor, or the almost imperceptible tensing of the cat's shoulder muscles. The others had brought their human noise, their frustration, their projecting fears. Chris brought only stillness. In that moment, Jess's academic interest blossomed into profound admiration. She wasn't watching a disabled man trying his best. She was watching a communication savant whose supposed deficit was, in fact, his greatest asset. He couldn't hear the distracting, terrifying hisses, so he was free to listen to everything else. That evening, Jess didn't go home and write field notes. She sat in her small apartment, the image of Chris and Soot replaying in her mind. It was a scene of such profound, quiet connection that it felt sacred. To interrupt it with a clumsy, shouted question or a scribbled note felt like a violation. How do you ask a man like that about his methods without shattering the very peace that makes them work? The answer came to her not from her linguistics textbooks, but from a place of simple human respect. You don't enter his world on your terms. You learn to walk through his door. She downloaded a highly rated American Sign Language app and spent the next 3 hours in a state of intense concentration. Her fingers, used to flying across a keyboard, fumbled through the alphabet, tracing awkward shapes in the air. The signs for cat and help were simple enough, but stringing them into a coherent thought was like learning to breathe underwater. She practiced in front of a mirror, her own face a mask of determination. This wasn't for a grade or a university credit. This was for the quiet man and the angry cat. 3 days later, armed with a handful of shaky but heartfelt signs, she found her moment. Chris was in the isolation ward, his back to the door. He had just finished cleaning Soot's litter box and was standing for a moment, simply observing the cat, who was now watching him from the corner of his cage without a single hiss. Jess took a deep breath, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She stepped into his line of sight and waited for him to notice her. When his eyes met hers, she slowly, deliberately raised her hands. Her movements were clumsy, hesitant. "You are helping him." She signed, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she added the sign she'd practiced the most, the one that felt the most important. "It is beautiful." Chris froze. His entire body went rigid, his gaze locked on her fumbling hands. For a moment he just stared, his expression a kaleidoscope of shock, confusion, and something else, something raw and unguarded. The other volunteers used gestures, yes, a thumbs up, a wave, but this was different. This wasn't a gesture at him. This was language. This was a bridge being built, plank by painstaking plank, across the silent abyss that had become his life. He felt a hot sting behind his eyes, a sensation so foreign he'd almost forgotten it. It was the first time since the fire that someone had tried not just to communicate with him, but to connect. He gave a short, sharp nod, a universe of gratitude contained in that single, jerky motion. That single, signed sentence cracked open a door Chris thought was sealed forever. Their interactions began to transform, evolving from a one-sided attempt into a shared project. Jess would bring a small notebook and a pen, not for him to read, but for her to jot down questions she couldn't yet sign. She'd point to a word like afraid or trust, her expression questioning, and he would teach her the sign, his large, scarred hands moving with a surprising, articulate grace. He was a patient teacher, correcting her hand shapes with a gentle tap. In return, she became his voice, not just his interpreter. Their silent lessons often took place near Soot's cage, the angry cat serving as their quiet, watchful chaperone. As Jess's vocabulary grew from single words to halting phrases, so did the depth of their conversations. One afternoon, as Soot rested with his back turned to them, a new, less defensive posture, Jess signed, "Why him? Why so patient?" Chris looked from her to the cat, a shadow passing over his face. He took a deep breath, his hands beginning to move, to tell a story he hadn't shared with anyone. He signed about the fire. Not the heroic, newspaper-clipping version, but the terrifying, sensory reality of it. He described the suffocating heat that felt like swallowing razors, the acrid taste of smoke, the disorienting chaos of a world coming apart. Then his hand slowed, shaping the most painful memory of all. He signed about the final moments, the groaning protest of the main support beam, a deep, earth-shaking rumble he felt in the marrow of his bones, and then nothing. He tapped his ear, then made a sweeping gesture of finality. The last sound, then quiet, forever. He looked at Soot, his expression one of profound, gut-wrenching empathy. He is trapped. In the noise of that day. I am trapped. In the quiet. We are the same. Jess felt a lump form in her throat, the kind that words couldn't fix. She had been studying communication as an academic discipline, a system of rules and structures. Chris was showing her its soul. She shared her own perspective, signing about how words could be masks, how spoken language was often filled with meaningless chatter that obscured true feelings. "You don't hear the lies," she signed, her own hands more confident now. "You only feel the truth." A partnership was forged in that shared understanding. They began to work with Soot together. Chris would lead, using his silent, intuitive approach, while Jess would stand by, observing, learning, and bridging the gap to the rest of the world. She started explaining his methods to the shelter manager, translating his silent expertise into words others could understand. "He's not trying to dominate him," she explained one day, as the manager watched, skeptical. "He's creating a space of absolute safety. He's letting the cat dictate every single interaction." With every sign learned, with every shared insight, Chris felt another layer of his internal armor flake away. The identity of Chris, the broken firefighter, was slowly, carefully being replaced by Chris, the man who speaks to cats, a title he was beginning to accept and even embrace with a sense of quiet pride. The day of the annual funding review arrived like a cold front. Mrs. Albright, a stern, impeccably dressed woman from the Pet Alliance Foundation, was the sole arbiter of the shelter's financial fate for the coming year. Her presence cast a pall of anxiety over the entire facility. Her foundation's grant was the lifeblood that kept the lights on and the food bowls full. The shelter manager, a perpetually stressed woman named Sarah, wrung her hands as she led the tour, pointing out the successes. The recently adopted litter of kittens, the new, more spacious enclosures. But her smile was tight, her voice strained. The elephant in the room was in the isolation ward. Sarah had already broached the subject with Jess and Chris a few days prior. His file is a sea of red flags, she'd said, her gaze fixed on Soot's cage. Aggression, unmanageable bite risk. If Mrs. Albright asks to see our most challenging cases, I'm worried. We may have to consider the alternative. The word euthanasia was left unspoken, but it hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Now, as the tour concluded, Mrs. Albright scanned her clipboard. And what about your long-term residents? Any particularly difficult rehabilitation cases? Sarah's face went pale. Before she could formulate a diplomatic answer, Jess stepped forward, her heart pounding. We have one, she said, her voice clear and steady. His name is Soot, and we believe he's on the verge of a breakthrough thanks to one of our volunteers. A tense silence fell. Sarah shot Jess a look of pure panic, but Jess held her ground, her gaze meeting Mrs. Albright's. I'd like you to see it. Moments later, a small group stood before Soot's enclosure. A skeptical Mrs. Albright, a terrified Sarah, and a resolute Jess. Chris stood by the door, his face calm. Jess turned to him and signed, they are afraid. They don't understand. Can you show them? Chris gave a single firm nod. He unlatched the cage and swung the door open, then stepped inside the small room, closing the door behind him. He didn't bring treats or toys or any tools of the trade. He brought only himself. He moved to the center of the room and slowly, deliberately, sat down on the cold concrete floor, tucking his legs beneath him. He didn't look at Soot. He simply sat, his hands resting, palms up on his knees. Through the viewing window, the onlookers watched. Soot, huddled in the far corner, was a statue of tense muscle, his yellow eyes burning. Minutes stretched into an eternity of silence. Nothing happened. Sarah began to fidget nervously. Then Soot took a single, hesitant step forward. He paused, testing the air. Chris didn't move a muscle. Another step. And another. Slowly, cautiously, the cat crossed the floor. He stopped just inches from Chris's outstretched hand, his nose twitching. He looked at the hand, then up at the man's impassive face. For a long, breathless moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a delicacy that defied his feral nature, Soot leaned forward and gently, tentatively, rubbed the side of his face against Chris's knuckles. A collective gasp went through the small audience. Chris slowly raised his other hand, bringing it to the cat's back. He didn't pet him. He just rested it there, a silent offering of weight and warmth. And then a miracle. A low, rumbling vibration started, a sound no one in the shelter had ever heard from this cat. It was a purr. Jess turned to the stunned Mrs. Albright, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with emotion. He isn't taming him, she said. He's telling him, I hear your silence. The impact of that moment rippled through the shelter, with the force of a seismic event. Mrs. Albright, her stern facade completely dissolved, simply stared through the window, her hand pressed to her mouth. The purr, a sound she could hear but Chris could not, was the most powerful testimony imaginable. She didn't just approve the standard funding. She announced on the spot that the Pet Alliance Foundation was creating a new, special grant. It would be used to establish the Silent Understanding Program, a behavioral rehabilitation initiative for animals with severe trauma, modeled on Chris's methods. And she insisted that Chris be hired with a proper salary as its lead consultant. Chris learned of the news through Jess's flying, ecstatic hands. As she signed job, new program FOR, he just shook his head slowly, a disbelieving smile spreading across his face. It wasn't about the money. It was the title, the purpose, the irrefutable proof that what he possessed wasn't a deficiency, but a rare and valuable gift. Weeks later, Soot, now a transformed, trusting companion, found his forever home. He was adopted by a quiet, retired librarian who had lost her husband in a house 5 years ago. She didn't want a playful kitten. She wanted a companion who understood grief. She understood his need for space, his lingering shadows. It was a perfect match. On a bright, warm afternoon, Chris and Jess sat on a newly installed bench outside the shelter, a gift from the foundation. The air was filled with the contented sounds of the cattery, a symphony Chris could feel in the vibrations of the wood beneath him. They conversed in the fluid, expressive dance of ASL, their hands weaving stories and jokes in the sunlight. He was no longer the silent ghost in the periphery. He was the heart of the shelter's most important work. He had walked into this place seeking refuge from a world that no longer made sense, and in the process of saving its most broken souls, he had found a way to save himself. He had lost the world of sound, but he had gained a new one, richer and more profound than he could have ever imagined, with a friend who had been willing to learn its beautiful, silent language.